Hi, this is Nancy with On Point TV and Quilting with Nancy. Thank you very much for purchasing my t-shirt quilt pattern and video. Going to take you through all the steps needed to make that t-shirt quilt something unique that nobody else has. And these techniques can be used for many other quilts too, so keep that in mind. I want to start by showing you some of the quilts that I've made using this technique, or at least this idea. So this first quilt that I made, I actually colored those pages. I photocopied the coloring book pages onto the photo fabric that's pre-treated. You just put it right through your photocopy machine. And I used a lot of fabric markers, a lot of different things like that, and created the quilt. On this quilt, for all of the sashings, I did a kind of black and gray square combination, and that's what we're also going to use in our t-shirt quilt. So here you can see how cool it looks if you've got a lot of really bright t-shirts, that you could just make it with the black and white or black and gray squares. And if you were to count how many different fabrics I used in this, I'm thinking I probably used 15 different darks and 15 different grays. My theory is if you're going to use 5 fabrics, why not use 50 fabrics? The more fabrics, the better. You're also then not restricted to just a few of the fabrics, and if you run out, you can always add more. Whereas if you only use 2 fabrics and you run out, you have to run back to the store. So doing it this way, where you're using a lot of variety, you don't have to worry about running out of any fabrics. Now this particular quilt each block is the exact same size. The truth is that with t-shirts, that's not the way it happens. So on the next quilt I made for my son, I used a lot of his theater type shirts, and you'll see that there's a lot of different sizes going on here. Now when I made this quilt, I had not had the plan that I included with the t-shirt pattern now, where I actually knew where everything was going to go again. I just was kind of wheeling and dealing as I went, adding a coping strip here and there, adding a few more blocks, and it was fun. But in the end, I ended up with quite a few leftover t-shirts that I had prepared, but I wasn't able to use in the quilt. And I think if I had done this pre-planning method back then, I wouldn't have had that issue. I would have been able to use all the t-shirts that I wanted. Now with this, instead of the checkerboard look, this is what it looks like if you just use a large variety of fabrics. Every color in the rainbow is in here. And I used some fabrics that were more specific to my son. So there's some cats, and there's some beer, and there's some bikes. So just a few things that he liked to make it more just for him. On this quilt, the one thing that I'll point out a little bit later on is these t-shirts that have that rubbery feel to it. When a t-shirt has the rubbery feel on it, as opposed to just a nice screen printing, it does make it very difficult to quilt it. That does not mean that you can't use that t-shirt in the quilt, but it does mean that it's a t-shirt that you're going to have to take extra special care in pressing and in the quilting. So this quilt, using a lot of different squares for the sashings. The next quilt was the quilt that I did with the first of this planning like we do is in the t-shirt pattern. Now what I did not do in this quilt that I wish I had done is I did not plan my rows. So without planning the rows, I ended up with some set-in seams. So if you look here on this corner, this block comes down to this row, but you see that it does not, it cuts right into that t-shirt, which means I had to do a set-in seam there. Not that that's a problem, set-in seams aren't particularly difficult, but it did make the whole construction honestly just a little bit harder. Whereas now with the t-shirt pattern and the graphing that I'm going to show you how to do, you won't have to worry about any of the set-in seams. You'll be able to create the quilt, and nobody will ever even realize that you've done the rows that are so simple to put together. Now in this quilt, because my husband had a lot of blue and orange quilt or t-shirts, I chose some blues, greens, reds, and oranges to do the checkerboard with. Again, I used lots of different fabrics. I was not going to run out of any fabric, but that blue and the orange are a contrast color and they look really cool, I think, in this type of a setting. Now, one thing you won't notice with this quilt, and I'll show you the bottom of it here in a second, is any white blocks. So as we see to the bottom here, I chose to not include the white t-shirts, but instead to dye the white t-shirts. I just didn't want to do that look. It's perfectly fine. If you like the idea of the white squares, do just the white. But these squares here, this one, this Bronco, the white caps, those did come from white t-shirts, but I dyed them with Jacquard Dynaflow. Jacquard Dynaflow is not a dye, so you don't have to have all the masks and the gloves and the whole kind of chemistry set to be doing dyeing. Dynaflow from Jacquard is actually a very fluid paint, and it's an acrylic paint, so it's totally permanent on the shirts. So if you chose, you could turn any of your white t-shirts into any color you wanted. So with the Dynaflow, and that is DYE-NA-flow from Jacquard, you can create anything, any color you want with all your t-shirts. So don't, let's say that you have a whole bunch of blue t-shirts and you have one white one. Well, unless you're going to put that in the very center of the quilt, I think I would rather dye it and then make the setting square some different colors. So just another design option for you to think, all right? So this quilt using blue and orange, or blue and green, and red and orange for the checkerboard style. Another note with checkerboard style, if you choose to make your quilt with the checkerboard style sashings, it does increase the difficulty of the construction just one little step. Not outrageously so, but it comes from the fact that you need to be sure when you're creating your blocks that the blue and orange are in the placement that they need to be to match up to the next square. So using my method with the graphing, you'll be able to have a plan. You'll know whether or not you need a blue or an orange in any different part. So it's not like it's hard, but you do have to be much more conscious about what fabrics are going in what placement in the quilt. So let's start with just looking at a t-shirt. So I've got this simple t-shirt, and I'm going to put that Mickey Mouse, and well, I think it's Mickey and Minnie, I'm going to put them into a t-shirt. So the first thing we need to do is cut up the t-shirt, and this is how I do it. I don't use my rotary cutter to start with. I use a good pair of scissors. So I like to first cut off the sleeves. So you need to have a good enough pair of scissors that you're able to get through some of these t-shirt seams. There. And I must always cut out all of my designs with at least 2 extra inches than you actually need. We will be trimming these down to the size that we actually need later. So when I am just doing my first chopping, I don't always just cut off on the side seam, although you could, but the reason I don't is I like to use the back of the t-shirts for either rags, household rags or garage rags, or they're just, it's a nice cotton fabric. It makes a really nice rag, so I want it to be as big as possible. Or you can use that leftover fabric to make one of the masks. So masks are something that we're all wearing in a lot of different scenarios now. And I found that using that cotton fabric to make a mask, whether or not it's a cone shape or the pleated kind, it makes a very, very comfortable mask. So I like to leave a bigger piece. So instead of cutting right down the side, I'm going to just visually look at it. I'm going to cut so that I'm at least 2 inches away from little Mickey and Minnie. This also is a very, very thin t-shirt, which is, we're going to put stable or interfacing on it anyhow. Oops, I accidentally cut right through. anyhow, but this would be one that would definitely have to be. We'll talk a little bit more about the interfacings here in a little bit. Then I'll cut down low here. Just making sure, I'm not measuring, but I'm making sure that I have at least 2 inches so that when it comes time, I can cut it exactly the size I need it and not have to worry about adding things that I don't want to. Now in this case, there's nothing on the back of the shirt, so I'm just going to cut off the neck. So now I have, this one, I'm going to cut off that bottom, and I did cut a hole in it too. But now I have a nice big rag, so this can be used for a lot of different things, so I like to recycle those and use those in my house or in the garage or drying the truck, whatever the case may be. Now I'm going to cut off the neck. Now when I do this, I'm going to make this extreme. I had somebody in the class that had a t-shirt that the design came up on the neck and then came down around the neck, and she didn't want to leave the neck in it, but yet she didn't want to lose the ears. I think it was a wolf in there. So when she cut it, it looked kind of like that, where it was cut out at the top, and she wasn't sure how was she going to fix that so she did not lose the ears of the wolf. And what we came up with I thought was pretty good. Take an extra piece, so using your little scrap piece, your rag piece. Because this is a jersey knit, you do not have to worry about these fraying, okay? So if you'll take the piece, an extra piece, and I just cut a little square out of this, lay the top that you want on top of it, and then before you do any of the interfacing that we're going to do next, just take and stitch that down. So just a couple rows. You could do a zigzag if you wanted, just enough for it to stay in place. Then you'd be able to cut it straight across the top. That way you're not going to lose any of the design if it does come up into the, maybe into the neck and shoulder area. I don't have that scenario here. Minnie's ears are just not that big, so I'm going to cut off this extra. And I wasn't able to leave a whole 2 inches at the top, but I'll be able to make it work. There you go. So this is my t-shirt that I'm going to work with. The next step is to put the interfacing on it. So very carefully going to lay it down onto my pressing board. Now my pressing board, this is one of those wool mats. It's about a 1/2 inch thick. It's really wonderful for working with these. It just, having this big space too, I was able to purchase this one that's the same size as my big board. So this is like 22 by 60 inches. It's really wonderful. It is worth all of the money that I spent on it. And trust me, it was a lot of money. But if you have a big board and you do as much quilting as I do, you're going to find it to be extremely wonderful to have. If you can't get one like this, this is the normal size. So this particular one is 18 by 24 inches. And it's expensive too. It's somewhere between $45 and $60. They do make smaller ones, but I gotta tell you, the smaller ones just really don't have any, they're just too small. Unless you're gonna use it for paper piecing, which I don't think is necessary for paper piecing, I can't see getting a smaller one being to your advantage. So my recommendation, if you're gonna get one of these wool mats for pressing, and I highly recommend you do, don't get a smaller one. Save that money until you've got enough funds to get at least the 18 by 24. This is a perfect size for taking to classes. It fits right in my tote that holds my 18 by 24 cutting mat. So everything about it. Love that. And then have your family combine birthdays, Christmas, anniversary, and any other celebration you can think of to be able to purchase one of these larger mats for your ironing board. I do have a source for them, so if you're interested, contact me at quiltingwithnancy@gmail.com. All right, so now let's talk about interfacing. The interfacing of choice is a woven, fusible, lightweight interfacing. So one of the brands, this is from Pellon, it is the SF101. That's what they call the Shape Flex cotton woven fusible interfacing. There's also one called Stacy's Shape Flex. I believe that is also a woven fusible. That is the best interfacing for a t-shirt quilt. But it's not always available. At this point in time, it's very hard to find this particular type of interfacing. So if you can't get this kind, you can use another lightweight fusible interfacing. The reason for the woven is because it takes a stretchy fabric, t-shirts, jersey, it's very stretchy, and makes it not stretchy. So even in the construction of it, it's going to hold together better, but more importantly, in the longevity of the quilt. As you're washing and using this quilt, and these quilts are made to be used. So that's why you make a t-shirt quilt. The washing of it, it will last a lot longer if you choose to use the woven fusible interfacing. All right. The other thing is save these little pieces. These little pieces, if you run out of some big pieces or you've just got some small ones, you can actually overlap them about 1/4 of an inch and cover an entire piece with it, and it'll hold up beautifully. So even these smaller pieces, I hold on to. It's not a very inexpensive interfacing, so when something costs that much, I'm not going to waste any of it. So I will save these pieces, and I do generally buy it by the bolt. So my bolt is all done. So here's my last large piece of the fusible interfacing. I've got my t-shirt faced down, and because this is such a fine weight jersey, I am not going to pre-cut it any more than this. Oftentimes I will cut it closer to the size that I need, or maybe even the exact size, let's say a 12.5, and cut it down, then do my interfacing. But this is such a stretchy jersey, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to put the interfacing down right now before I cut it down into a size. So laying the fusible down, glue side down, on top of the back of the t-shirt, using my iron, and my iron, I have an Oliso iron. This was a limited edition pink one, but it does a lot of different things like going up on its legs like that. It also has a very flat faceplate, and I love that. So with the very flat faceplate, I don't get any of those little bumps and stuff. It presses everything beautifully, and I am not going to use steam at this point. I do use steam a lot in my quilt making, but not at this point. And when I'm pressing it, I'm going to be very patient. So that means you put your iron down and you hold it there, and then you move it. So you're not just whipping around on the interfacing, which is another reason that I like this fusible cotton woven better than a regular lightweight. The lightweight ones are usually a polyester, possibly even some rayon in there, and that means you have to be a lot more careful when you're doing the pressing. If you're a quilt maker at all, you know that using cotton fabrics, that means that you can really put the iron down and let the iron do its job and not have to worry about melting your cotton fabric. Cotton fabric can't melt. With this, I'm just leaving it down. I think I'm 10 seconds at least in each spot. And you can't do that if you're using the normal lightweight fusible interfacing that is very common in garment making, and I use it all the time for garments, just not for t-shirt quilts. So a little bit more pressing here. And when I came to the sides, I just kind of moved my iron next to the edge. I can see, I know you can't see it, but I can see the edge of my t-shirt. So I'm just a smidge in from the edge. I will, after I trim this, I'll be able to press it out a little bit more. All right, one more, it just doesn't feel quite right. And then after you press it, let it cool a little bit. After I let this cool, we're going to take this to my cutting table and we'll cut it down to the size we need for our quilt. My Mickey t-shirt is all cooled, so now it's time for me to decide what size to trim it, and then record all my t-shirts and start doing the design. So looking at this t-shirt, I am going to use my 15-inch ruler. I think a 15-inch ruler is just the right size for a t-shirt quilt. Sometimes you want to go a little bit larger, and you need to always trim your quilts for this design so that they are in a 2-inch increment. So if we look at this kind of a block, the t-shirt itself I cut into a 4.5, and then that works perfectly with the 2-inch finished squares. So we've got, if you're always cutting your t-shirts down into a 2-inch increment and then adding the 1/2 inch to that, it will always work out mathematically for the 2-inch strips to add to it. There might be some times that you will have to do, I don't have one handy right now, that you might have to do a coping strip. I'll show you a coping strip on one of the quilts that I've worked on later and talk to you a little bit more about that. So I'm going to decide on this Mickey block for him to be trimmed. I'm thinking I'd like to have a little bit, so if I do maybe 1.5 inches here on Minnie's ear, and they are kind of tipped, and actually with the fusible on it, I can choose to tip my ruler. I don't have to be straight square. I can go with the design because this is such a lightweight jersey. I could do this 10.5 inches wide going across. So here at Minnie's ear, I have 1.5 inches. Oh, I got a little bit more there, so let's go from 10.5 inches to Minnie's ear. I have 1 3/4 inches, and to this side I have 1 3/4 inches. And let me go as high up as I can. And let's cut that first. First on the right, then on the left. Move my interfacing out of the way because I will definitely be saving that piece. Now I have sprayed a little basting onto my ruler. That helps keep things sticking so when I'm cutting these out. All right, so we've decided 10.5 on the width. So my vertical is going to go 10.5. Now, how tall can I make him? If I make him 12.5, if I go to 12.5, oh, that would be perfect. With 12.5, I'll have about 3/4 of an inch on the top and about 1 inch on the bottom. So this will be divisible by 2, just like I need it. Now my Minnie and Mickey square are perfectly ready for my t-shirt quilt. Now I don't have a t-shirt quilt that I'm actually going to use these in right now. So now we're going to do this and then I'll record some more. So after you have him cut, the next step is to record what it is that you have. So this is one of the charts that I had. So on this chart, I wrote tall, long, and color, and I decided wide and tall are better, and then color. So let me show you what that looks like when you're doing your charting. So this particular block, I want to record the wide, then the tall, and then the color. Having these recorded is going to make it possible for you to make educated decisions in your design. You'll be able to place them where you want them. So he is 10 inches wide. I'm not going to include the 1/2 inch now. I want to know his finished size. He's 10 inches wide and 12 inches tall, and he is red. So let me get a couple of other designs. So here's another one from a quilt that I'm working on. This one is, he's already got his interfacing on. This one again is 10 wide, but 14 tall. 10 wide, 14 tall. And I'm going to say that this one is white. I could go through all of my t-shirt squares. So this little guy, he's 4 by 4 in gray. So let me do just a couple more. And let's get one that's a little bit different. Here, this guy. So he is 4 by 6. So more of a rectangle. 4 by 6, and he's black. All right, now once you have recorded all of the sizes of all of the t-shirts that you have, like I have here, now it's time to actually put them down on paper. So what we're going to do is take the graph. You were given 2 pieces of graph paper in the pattern. One of them has just squares, so I've used some of them already. And the other is actually done in a checkerboard style, and that's for you to be able to do the design layout on. So I'm going to take now my color pencils, and I'm going to make my literally draw the blocks in the size and color that I have. So I have a 10-inch by 12-inch. Each one of these is a 2-inch square. So I've got 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 inches wide by 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 inches tall. And I'm going to color him red. After you've colored him, and you don't need fancy coloring pencils for this, just something so that you know what color he is. After you've colored him, then I like to take something and either say what it is or what direction. So this one, I'm going to actually draw the Mickey and Minnie on it because that one's easy enough to do. All right, so I know that that guy, he is positioned vertically there. Now my next one is 10 by 14, and he's white, but I'm going to make him yellow just so that we're able to see him. So again, 10 wide, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. By 14, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14. And this one had that red, white, and blue type of a design. So instead of drawing the design, I'm just going to draw an arrow. So I know what position that needs to be in. Now I have a gray one that is 4 by 4, so he's just a little guy. And then another one that's black that is 4 by 6. There, and on this 4 by 6, I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see it, but I do need to know on the 4 by 6 which direction he goes. So all of these are going to be drawn out. After you've drawn them out, then you cut them. So this is taking you back to elementary school. We're just going to be cutting out our little designs. And save the graph paper. This is, I mean, obviously you have the pattern, so you can make as many copies as you need. The checkerboard graph paper you will be using up pretty much, but this piece you might be able to get 3 or 4 quilts out of just this one piece of graph paper. I had thought about putting a 12 by 12 graph paper in the pattern, but then I got to thinking about it. You can't make a photocopy of that on your normal printer, so I thought the 8.5 by 12 would be better. There, so now I have 4 little design pieces. I'm going to take my checkerboard graph. Let me put my pencils away, or at least out of the way. Get in there, little guy. There, all right. And I'm going to take a glue stick. Now, I have just a normal permanent glue stick here, but I got to thinking that a better option is a repositionable glue stick. A repositionable glue stick means that you would put the glue on the back of the paper and it actually turns it into a pretty secure Post-it note. So you can pick it up and put it down, pick it up and put it down. So that's going to give you a lot more versatility when you're doing your designing. Now I do a lot of my designing on the electric quilt program, and if you research their the electric quilt, I think it's electricquilt.com is their website, has a wonderful program. You can do so many cool things with that program, and one of them is making custom sets. And doing a custom set, you create your blocks just like this, and then you're able to place them so that when it's done, this one I actually did on EQ. So it looks so nice. Everything is positioned quite nicely, and I can see very easily what I have going on. Not that what we're doing isn't going to look nice. This is what we're going to do. But here's the idea. Just going to take my glue stick, put some on the back, and then place it. And when you're placing it, try, not always, but try to leave a 2-inch block. Oops, see this one I only left one at the top, so I'm going to sink him down. So that I'll have 2 inches, or 2 squares I should say, going all the way around on the top. Then my next block, I want to position him to be at least 2 squares apart. Now there might be sometimes that you won't do that. For design purposes, you've got a t-shirt that is not going to work quite right that way, so you don't have to leave the 2. I'm just trying to give you some easy rules to follow. So here's another little guy, and I'm going to drop him down here so he's actually lower than the Mickey Mouse one was. And my last one, paying attention to my arrows, keeping my t-shirt facing up. Not that you have to. Again, you could decide to have them go upside down and sideways if you choose. But that's the idea. Now, when you're doing this, you want to, let's go to this one that I've already designed. You want to position them so that you're able to have a straight row going across. So if I take this paper and we look at this one, if I go to the bottom of the lowest block, I can sew a straight line all the way across. That's good. All right, so let's do the next one. All the way across. Oh, look at now to the bottom of that one. Again, I can do a straight line. Coming here, this one's going to be a little bit different. Instead of 2 squares between, it's only got 1. But I've got that straight line, and that's what matters going down. That will make your construction so much easier. I also wish I had done this with the repositionable, because I would like to, if this is the bottom of the quilt, I would like to have moved him down a little bit, maybe centered him up a little bit better. So after you're done, actually this one here, I wish I had moved him over. And if I had used a repositionable, I could have done that. So when that is done, this quilt would measure 66 inches wide and 88 inches long. You don't have to use all the graph paper. Use just what you need. You also are able to take, let me see if I have a blank sheet of graph paper. There. You can take your extra, make other copies of your graph paper, cut them apart, and you could glue them together to make them really large. So if you wanted this to be a really large quilt, go ahead and make extra copies of your graph paper, cut off the edge, tape them all together, and you could have a king-size t-shirt quilt, which would be pretty extreme, but it would also be pretty cool. After you have done your placements with it like this, it's time to draw your rows and blocks. So that's what this is. This is what that's going to look like. So this is what it's going to end up doing, but I'm going to do it on this sheet so you'll see it happen. So starting here, I'm going to get just a straight edge of a ruler. I'm going to first start with the rows, and keeping in mind I want my rows to go all the way across one straight line. So if I go to the lowest block in this row and position using my Sharpie marker so I can really see it, there it is. That is my first row right there. Now going to my second row, again finding my lowest block. These two are equal, that works. Draw my line. This is my second row. Coming to the next one, right there. Now in this case, I hope you can see this. The row actually goes between these double squares. I find it easier to keep those together. So instead of drawing the line at the bottom of these blocks, cutting that row apart, I'm going to make my row at the top of the next one. It will just make the construction just a little bit easier so I can have everything working in the little 4 patches. And then the next one, there, next one I can't do that. I have to split down here. I'm going to have to split that one up because the lowest block is here. So I have to. All right. So there's my 3rd row, 4th row, and 5th row going to the edge of my quilt. Now I'm going to create my blocks. So each one of these blocks will be made one at a time. So right now it might look a little bit confusing, but once you break down your blocks, you'll realize it's not. So this block will have that 14 by 14 inch concert t-shirt, and it'll be split right there. So I will just add the squares around there. This one, 14 by 16, I think I will have this block go all the way to here. I could have had it go here. It really doesn't matter either way. And then this 8-inch block there. So now you can see that block isn't that hard to make. Those blocks will go together and create that row very easily. Nothing tricky. So let me continue and create our blocks. And down here. And when I'm making these blocks, I'm going to be very conscious because I am doing the checkerboard style. All the way down here. And this one is going to be a very large block with a lot of 3 rows, and here are 4 rows. I could have moved him over. This guy, in the construction of him, I will move him over. And then I would drop that block down, but that would be one large block down at the bottom. So there you see it. The quilt is all divided up into the blocks and the rows for really, really easy construction. Now it's time for us to take our fabrics that we want for our checkerboard and cut them up. So let's clean off some of this. Keep my design handy so I know what I'm going to be working on. Move some things out of the way. So I've already got some of my squares made for this, but let me show you. Oh, I'm going to have to grab some bigger squares to cut. Be right back. There. So these colors would be much, much brighter, but this is the idea. I like the strips to be no longer than 18 inches, or I'm sorry, 22 inches. So this is a fat quarter, so I can cut this the full length of the fat quarter, folding it in half. These are pretty wild fabrics. They didn't quite make the cut when I was deciding on what fabrics I was going to use. And lay him on top. Now I could take the time to press him, but in truth, I might do it if I was teaching, but I wouldn't do it if it were real life. I'd just leave it just like this, okay? The first thing we need to do is cut off our edge. So I'm going to grab my 12.5-inch ruler and lay him down. This is the edge I'm going to cut off. I'm going to line up on the horizontal line of my ruler, the fold of that fat quarter, and I have them stacked up, so just a little bit offset by about 1/4 of an inch, so I can cut at least 2 at a time. Most of the time I'll do a few more than that to speed things up. Now I have a squared edge. I want to cut these strips 2.5 inches, and I'm going to use the power cutting technique. So the idea, if I want 2.5-inch strips, if I add those together, 2.5 plus 2.5 is 5, plus 2.5 is 7.5. So just for the sake of this one, I'm going to only cut from 7.5, but I could go to the 10 and the 12.5. So starting at 7.5, using the glow tape to remind me where my cut is, and my original perfect cut, I cut my strip. Now I move the ruler over to 5, 2.5 inches over, again using the original cut as my measuring guide, and then move it over one more time, so I'm at 2.5 inches. That's how you're going to cut your strips. Once you have cut your strips, depending on the colorways that you're choosing, so these are the wild colors I'm using, pink and reds and greens and oranges, you want to kind of put them together in sets. So I had 3 of these red fabrics. I'm sorry, 3 of these blue fabrics. Looks like I don't have them anymore. I must have already sold them. But let's say I've got 2 of them. If I've got 2 of those I'm going to take my contrast color and I'm going to pair this one up with the sunflower fabric, but then I'm going to go to another one of my fabrics in that colorway and pair it up with that. So the same thing with the green. I've got 1, 2 greens, that's my blue combination, and I'm going to pair that up with, here's one of the oranges, and then I can do again the sunflower fabric. So each time they're getting paired up with something different. That's just going to make it a little bit easier when you're starting to do your designing, that you have, so that you don't have this fabric with only sunflowers or this fabric with only that orange. You've got a variety of them cut and paired up together. Now we're going to take these fabrics and go to the sewing machine. We're going to talk about our scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. A scant 1/4 inch seam allowance is so important with this quilt because the blocks are cut to the perfect 12.5 inches. You need not only your strips to be cut very accurately, but you also need your scant 1/4 inch to be accurate so that when these are sewn together, they will sew together at the width that they need to be. All right, so I'll meet you at my sewing machine next. Now we're ready to sew our strips together, but before we can sew the strips, like I said, we need to be sure that we have a really good scant 1/4 inch. And I think this little tool is probably the best tool to help with your accuracy. This comes from Guidelines for Quilting, and they're just little seam guides. This is the little seam guide. He's an adhesive one, comes maybe 6 or 8 in a pack. They're not very expensive, so I highly recommend you take a look for those. I think you can get them on, my friend has a website called firesidequilts.com. I'm pretty sure she has those here. So let's come on in and I'll show you how we put these on the sewing machine. So I'm using my large FAF machine. This is my FAF Icon. This is the machine I use for most of my sewing. I can do my machine quilting on it, but I don't often. Oftentimes I do that on my hobby quilter. So I'm going to first lower my presser foot. Now this machine, I can move the needle from the right to the right, from the left to the right. There we go. So I'm going to place my seam guide right here, right next to my foot. And then I'm going to edit my stitch by moving the needle to the right. So if you watch here, you can see my needle moving to the right. Now I've pretty much figured this one out, but I do like to always test it a little bit. On this machine, if I go to 3.0 moving over, I have moved my needle from center to just about here. That oftentimes works quite nicely. So let me get my 2 testing pieces. I got 2 pieces just cut off from the 2.5s that I already had. Get those ready. Start with the leader. I do have 100% cotton thread in here because I am making a quilt. So I like to just kind of rest my finger right here, and that keeps the fabric from jumping up onto the guide, but yet I'm not pushing it down either. Coming to the end, jump onto a leader again. And one moment, please. I forgot a pair of scissors. There. Now I've got a pair of scissors, so I can cut my piece off and cut my leader off. Now we'll go to the ironing board and see if we've done the scant 1/4 inch properly. So in this quilt, if you are working checkerboard style, you'll want to press, when possible, to the dark fabric. So I want this seam to go toward the blue fabric. That means I'm going to place the blue fabric on top with the seam away from me. And then I'm going to set the seam. Now flip it up and press it up. Now usually here I would use some steam, but the steam tends to cloud up the camera a little bit, so we're not going to use any steam. But our piece is pressed, and you see that the seam is going toward the blue fabric. Now let's measure. What size did it end up? Measuring from top to bottom, I've got a 4.5 inch piece. Taking the 1/4 inch off in the middle, that means that scant 1/4 inch is as close as I'm going to be able to get it. Now I do want to show you how you can do the same thing if you don't have a sewing machine whose needle can move to the right or to the left. Most modern sewing machines, you can do that, but I know there's a lot of quilters out there still working on a machine that can't, and it's great because you can still do all of this. You can even use one of those featherweight sewing machines. There's no needle moving to the right or the left on those, but you can still use these seam guides. So this is how you do that. So let me first lift my presser foot and my thread and get this out of the way. I'm going to take my seam guide off. Now the seam guide is removable and you can use it for, I'm going to say maybe 20 hours of sewing. So first let me get my needle back into centered position. All right, let's say I cannot move my needle. So now I'm going to put my ruler under my presser foot. And I know that it's hard for you to see, but the idea here is I'm going to roll my needle down so that the needle is coming just to the right of that 1/4 inch. So if we go here, this one here, I think you can see, that's the 1/4 inch mark. I want my needle to come down to the right of it. That's why it's called a scant 1/4 inch. Then line your ruler up square with your machine, and this time place the seam guide in front of the feed dogs. You can't place it back there on the feed dogs or else those feed dogs would be chewing it up. But now, oops, I do have to roll my needle up. There we go, get my ruler out. Now I could use that as my seam guide with my needle in the center position. So if you don't have the ability to move your needle to the right, that's okay. You can still use these seam guides to really help improve with your scant 1/4 inch. But I can, so I'm going to redo this again to work with my machine. Always work with what you have. I've got this machine, I'm going to work with it to do everything I need it to do. Let me move my needle over. Couple more, there we go. So now it's time to sew a few strips together. So starting on my leader, now I'm going to grab, coming around behind my camera person, excuse me Athena. There we go. Going to grab these 2 strips. So I've got a blue and an orange, and I'm going to put them right sides together. So I always like to hold my strips up and then kind of blossom them out on the top to make sure that I have my 2 right sides together. And I can sew this strip with my scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. Positioning them together. I don't do any pinning at this point. I will be doing some pinning later on, but not when I'm sewing strips. And if you just rest your finger very carefully on top of the fabric and then also right next to that seam guide, you can get some strips sewed together really quickly. So that's one, so let's do another one. I'm going to chain piece these just like it's when you're making other quilts. If you're a quilter, you've heard all about chain piecing. Right sides are together. Here's my next strip set. And then get my leader to sew off onto and cut this apart and then go to our ironing board. There. All right, so for the pressing of this size wool mat works perfectly because it's only the 22 inches long, so we'll be able to use our mat just like it's meant to be used. Start with the dark fabric on top again. Set the seam, lifting your iron as you go, never pushing down as you go or you might stretch your fabric. Then flip it up and carefully press that seam or the fabric so it's going up. But I'm feeling here with my fingers to make sure that the seam underneath is not flipping to the wrong side. And again, I normally would use steam here because I like the crispness that I get with the steam. But now when you see it on the back side, you see that that seam is pressed toward the blue. Now this time I'm going to press it toward the green. So again, setting my seam, then flipping it up and pressing that seam toward the green fabric. Now that we have our strip sets made, it's time to cut our segments. So I'm going to move the iron out of the way here so that we're not bumping into it too much, and get my cutting mat. So with my two strip sets, I'm going to lay them down so that I can be more efficient in my cutting. If I start with the green on top, remembering that that seam is pressed toward the green, place this one on top of it, this seam is pressed down toward the blue, and you can line them up and feel that they're butt together. So one's going down, one's going up, so I can really feel that that is butting right together, and I can see it when I open it up, that that's going to look what it's going to look like. And then because I want to be efficient, I could start cutting my 2.5 inch squares from here, but I want to be more efficient than that. I can fold this in half one more time and start my cutting. So lining the ruler up so that one of the horizontal lines of the ruler is on the seam line. Now I don't use the inch mark. I like to use the 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch marks so that I can really see where those dots are. So it goes dot, 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 dot. All of those right in line on the stitching line. And cut. Then I can spin this around, and just like before, I can power cut these. So if these are 2.5, I could actually start at 10, lining up on my vertical side, and then lining up the dots to be right on the stitching. Cut one set, move over to 7.5, again, vertical, and the dots on the stitching. Go over to 5, vertical, and then dots on the stitching. And one last one at 2.5. So by positioning the fabrics the way that I did, I can now pick these up and they're ready to be sewn together. That seam allowance, they're butt right together, and I can just sew those just like that. So I'm going to take just a couple of these to my sewing machine and let's sew those together. I already have my leader in place because I left it there last time. I can feel right here that it's butt together. I do oftentimes like to use my awl to help hold that in place, but I left that at the other table, so we'll just deal without it. I do want to always be sure this one started with the orange on top and the green on the bottom, or the red and blue, that idea. I want to continue that, always making it with the red on the top and the blue on the bottom. Now depending on what block you're doing, you might have to change that up to get that checkerboard style, but most of the time I like to keep it consistent and then change it up only when I have to. And just like always, I have now lost my scissors. There they are. There, cut that apart and we'll take this to the ironing board. Let's move these little guys out of the way. I want to show you how I press these. So what I could do here, whoops, gotta get my iron or I won't be pressing anything very far. What I could do here is set the seam like normal and then press this up. And that works. I'm not gonna say that doesn't work. But what this does create is that this piece right here is kind of thick. So if we look at it from the back side, these seams have only 3 pieces of fabric, the bottom layer and the 2 from the seam. This one only has the bottom layer, 2 from the seam and 2 from the top. This one is the bottom layer, 2 from the seam, 2 from the top, 2 from the next one. So there's like 8 layers of fabric in that little square. So I like to actually try to avoid that when possible. So let me get the tool known as a seam ripper. So this is one of my fancy seam ripper awls that my friend Gina makes, and they are available on our website if you're interested. So they're just so pretty. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out those 2 little stitches on this side. So I just kind of flipped them out of the way. Now if I flip this over, do the same thing on the other side. Just take that out. I don't cut that thread, and I don't take the thread past the crossed seam, but just take it out so it's right there. Now when I open this up, I'm able to seam separate. To separate those seams, it creates a little teeny 4 patch right in the middle. And you can do this little trick anytime you have 4 squares. Oops, works better if I pay attention when I'm ironing instead of just talking. There. So it creates that little 4 patch, and what I like to do now is take a little spray sizing to make sure that that seam stays where I wanted it to be. If I've pressed it there, I want it to stay there. Now my square is much flatter in the center. So I'll use this anytime I'm making something with a 4 patch, and that includes pinwheels. If you ever do a pinwheel block, you know how bulky that can be in the center. This seam separating is quite wonderful for that. So let me do that again. I'll set the seam first. And sometimes you don't have to pluck it out. Let me see if this will work. If you just flip it, there it goes. I was able to get that to come out without having to use my seam ripper. It oftentimes depends on the stitch length that you're using in the fabric. I don't know why it's always different, but it is. And I only steam or spray size right there in the middle. Not that I'm opposed to spray sizing more, but I want this to dry a little bit quicker. So always press your spray sizing until it's completely dry. And I am using Mary Ellen's spray sizing. I've just put it in one of the mister bottles. It actually creates more of a mist and makes the sizing last a little bit longer. There. So now I'm going to look at my design and see what I actually need for this. All right. So this is the block that I'm creating. I'm creating this one. So I have my 4x6 black block. That's this. Next to that, I need a 4 patch that is blue and orange. Then another one that is blue and orange. And I just happen to have a few more made. Then grab one of these other ones. This guy is blue and orange. So that's going to be one row going all the way down. Underneath here, for this quilt, my friend that I'm making this for gave me all these fabrics, but she also gave me some charm packs. So for using the charm packs, I just cut these 5-inch squares down into a 4.5 inch. So I'm able to use these in this quilt also. So wherever I put one of these X marks, that's where I plan to use one of these charm packs. By putting it on the pattern, I'm more evenly spacing them around. So in this block, I'm just making that little guy. I've got a charm pack down there, and then just one of the sets of 2. So let's see. There's one. All right, going to use a set of 2 on top. There. So that's what my block is going to look like. So I'm going to take this to my sewing machine. Now, most of the time, you might find that the seams go in the correct position so that they're one going one way, one to the other. It doesn't always happen though, so I'll have to probably show you some of those. So I'm going to take this guy and this guy, and then I'll take this guy over here too. So come on over to the sewing machine again. I'm going to take my paper so I'm sure that I'm designing them correctly. So starting here with my leader. And I'm going to attach this set of 2 to my charm square. And then again, search for my scissors. I need to have one of those kind of guys that are around your neck, I guess, so that I can cut off this square. And I'm going to chain piece the entire block. So this went here, and I need to add one more square set of 4 to the bottom, keeping that blue orange together. And this is one of those times that the seams are not going in the correct position. They're both coming toward me. So that means I'm going to force one to go into the other direction. So I'm going to place it where I want it, flip him into the opposite direction, and use a pin to secure him right there, because I definitely don't want them stacked on top of another where I'm sewing it. I like these seam guides also because with my little clover glass head pins, it can float right over the seam guide. Nothing blocks it. And yes, I did just sew over a pin, and I lived to tell about it. I'm okay with that. I just be careful. All right. Now this goes right on top of my t-shirt square. Let's position him. So I've got my 2 little columns done for this block. So that means I'm going to end with my leader, and we'll go to our ironing board. This time I think I'm going to leave my scissors right here so we'll know where they're at next time. All right, so I've put these 2 together and these 2. And now these need to go together. And I always like to look at the back of it to see how I want to press it. So looking at this, so this is the one that I had to force him to go to the other side. But then I still can do that little seam separating right there. Force him down and use a little spray sizing to make sure he stays where I told him to stay. This one, I want to press, in this particular case, I'm going to press, since this seam is coming up, I'm going to press these down. I was surprised that it didn't really make that big of a difference whether or not the t-shirt was there in terms of the bulk. Now it might get a little bulkier if you're doing sweatshirts, but the t-shirts didn't really create much bulk on the seams. Now this one, if I press to the charm pack to the point of least resistance, that means this one needs to come up. And let me see if I can, that means I won't be able to do the seam separating. If I seam separate this, this one goes down, and then I'll press this one up. So always trying to look from the back of the block. That'll just ensure that your seams are going to match up the way that you want them to. And you might be thinking I'm using a lot of sizing. I do that all the time. Every single seam that I press. I don't usually do it when I'm doing the strips, but after I've done the strips and I'm putting pieces of the block together, I spray size it. When the block is done, I spray size it again. Ooh, and this has that little bit of a rubberiness on it, so I'm going to try to keep my iron away from it so that it doesn't get sticky on my iron. All right, so our block is ready to be sewn together. When I flip this over, I'm going to match the seams and put some pins in. Matching him. And then I don't usually need to put one on the top part there. So we're ready to go back to our sewing machine. So my leader is already in, so I can just start right off again. And so on. The pin just goes right over top of that seam guide. I love that. I do sew slowly over the pins, but I do sew over pins. I want my seams to be accurate, and that means I need to sew over pins to make it sew. Cut my leader off on the back. And back to the ironing board. So set my seam first, and then we can take a look and see how it is that we're going to press it. All right, I can't do any seam separating here, so now it's just a matter of deciding to press one way or the other. I think I'm going to press to the point of least resistance. So I've got these two squares with no seams, so pressing towards them makes it a little bit easier, an easier decision to make. And as always, spray size my seam. And those blocks that have rubber on them, you can press them from the back side. That's not going to hurt your iron or the t-shirt. So just be cautious when you're pressing them from the front side, that you don't hit that rubbery part on it. So my block is done. So when I look at how that's going to work into my quilt, I've got this block done. I need to create this block. I've already got these three sewn together. So use your chart that you've created as your little map. What comes next? What blocks do I do? How do I keep all my checkerboards going? Using a map like this, it makes it not that hard. Now, somebody did ask me, what if they don't want to make those little squares, the 2.5-inch squares? That's okay. Instead of doing the 2-inch squares here, so this being a 4-patch, you could make that just a square like I used the charm pack there, and do another square here, and then this at the bottom could just be one piece of fabric cut to the size that it needed. So that'd be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 12.5 inches by 4.5 inches, and just put one big piece of fabric there. As long as the fabric is interesting. I wouldn't want you to do that with like a really boring solid fabric or something like that. The last thing I wanted to show you is how we'll do the quilting, so we'll come back and talk about that. So I do realize that I forgot to talk about the coping strips. I just skipped right over it. So this is an example of what a coping strip would look like. So when I was cutting out this particular t-shirt, I didn't have enough fabric to make it divisible by 2. So if I look at this, this came out to a 15.5. It wasn't 16.5. I didn't have enough fabric. So instead, I cut it to the 15.5, take that seam allowance in there, and then added a 1.5-inch strip to the right-hand side, so that now the block is the 16.5 that I needed, finishing 16 inches. So coping strips can be a really creative way to add a little bit more fabric and interest to your quilts, and it really helps to bring the blocks up to the size that you need so that all of the squares work out. Now, when we're looking at the quilting designs, here is a couple of options. So on this quilt, I did the design, so you can see here on the gray blocks, I went around each block with 1/4 inch, and it goes into the little corners. Now, what I did not do is actually go around each block and then go to a next one. I went all the way up, going back and forth in these rows. And on this quilt, I did not quilt the black squares. I like that effect. I like that the one black square puffs up a little bit and the gray sinks down. But just so you know, that is not the sturdiest of quilting. These seams are not quite secured enough. Now, they're definitely secured enough for your normal quilts, but t-shirt quilts are typically well loved and well used, so they're going to be washed an awful lot. So although I like this, this would not be what I would choose for the t-shirt quilt. Instead, speaking of well-loved and well-worn, my son's quilt would be a great example of that. On this quilt, you can see where I have my sets of 2, where every one of them has that 1/4 inch stitching going around. And I'll do a drawing so that you'll see how that'll work, but that makes it much more secure. When it comes to the blocks, it all depends on what the block is printed with. So this block has some of that rubbery kind of stuff on it. So I was able to easily do some quilting in the white, just a little bit here on the trombone. But when it came to this piece, I was able to just barely go around the words, and I had some thread breakage, but it was okay. On this block, where all the names of the students are, that was easy. I just meandered in all the blank spaces. This is only 2 inches left anyway. But this portion has that rubbery. I wasn't really ready to quilt on that. As a general rule, I like my quilting to be equal density so that everything lays pretty nice. I still got nice texture to it, but that equal density of quilting, this does break my rule because having this section be so big, unquilted, it bothers me aesthetically, but it is what it is. The only way I could have quilted is to actually come in and quilt on each of the letters. And that will work, and that'll make it last longer. So you can see some of the different quilting that I've done on these. Let me draw that little design for you so you can see how that is. All right, so if we just have, I'm just going to draw simple squares, and we're going to make this be 4 inches by 6 inches, so the squares are 2 by 6. This is the way that you do that, and this is done free motion, and if you don't do your own free motion and you have a long armer do it, you could ask them to do this design for you also. So the idea is that you start in the corner and come over to the next corner. I call that bopping. I don't know why I call that bopping, but I do. I bop from one to the next. When I find a long line, I actually create what looks like an S going back and forth on that long line. When I get to the bottom, I come back up, crisscrossing at the intersections, then bop over to the next corner and then down. Here's a seam, so I need to S that, back and forth, bop down to the next one, do your S-ing, and back and forth. Now the insides are all done, so I just have to bop all the way around, trying to create that 1/4 of an inch in the center. That is definitely easier said than done. Your first few times doing it, you're going to want to probably try invisible thread, although invisible thread can be a pain to quilt with. For something like this, I think that it'll make it a little bit nicer in the end than using a high contrast thread. So there you have it. You put your blocks together, you put your rows together, put a border on it if you would like, and then quilt as desired. And then you have your very own t-shirt quilt, unique to just you and your t-shirts. If you'd like more information on some of the other things that I do have my pincushion pattern. This is Nancy's Fabulous Pincushion, and I have them made out of wool. I love these. They're with me wherever I go, and there are kits made with some different colors of wool that you can purchase too. My original book is a Learning to Quilt book. This takes you through all of the different techniques, so many more than I've actually just done in this t-shirt quilt. There's applique and half square triangles and flying geese and all the quilting, and all of the videos on our YouTube channel coincide with the book too, so take you through a lot of the different quilting techniques that I use. And then my newest book is The Great Basics. The Great Basics is a simplified quilt with 9 patch blocks set on point using a striped fabric in the setting squares and triangles. This book is made for beginners, so I've tried to keep it as basic as possible, and I do have all of the videos go along with the book too, so it will help teach you and follow it along, just like the t-shirt pattern and this video did. If you have any questions, you can email me at quiltingwithnancy@gmail.com. All of my books are available on the website. That's www.onpoint-tv.com. I hope that you really enjoyed this, and I would love to see a picture of your t-shirt quilt. Go ahead, send it to me. Talk to you soon.